Yes, you're leaving. Man, I didn't even say anything offensive yet. Hey, Gary.
Hey, what?
Do you know I get to preach Sunday on my favorite book of the Bible? That's really loud. Is there anybody up there that can turn that down?
No, but it's just going to be really cool.
It's going to be.
Don's there. He can fix it.
Don's up there. Thank you, Don.
It's fixed.
Thank you. I get to preach on my favorite book of the Bible Sunday.
I know.
You know what book that is?
Dominoes.
Dominoes. Numbers.
Oh.
I'm a math teacher.
I thought, numbers. I thought you liked Deuteronomy better than numbers.
Well.
But you like numbers.
Numbers, yeah. I get to talk about numbers all day, so.
I don't have a clue where we are because we've already had to work on our sermons for Deuteronomy so they could be in the handouts.
It's a little off-kiltering. Is that a word?
That is, it's a word now.
Okay.
It's off-kiltering.
If it's off-kiltering to be studying a week ahead and then have to go back and think about what you already studied.
And always be a week behind anyway. Did you bring your tape measure?
I didn't. I thought there was going to be a man dressed in white that was going to supply the tape measure.
Brought mine.
Okay. Ezekiel didn't have to take his own tape measure.
No, somebody gave it to him.
Yeah.
That's why I brought this for you, because I didn't figure you could bring yours.
I didn't.
Did you bring your router table?
No.
Okay.
That's it.
If we're going to build something,
Thankfully,
we need a router table.
We don't talk of that.
One of our members is having surgery on his hand tomorrow. It's scheduled at noon. And he's having some screws and a pin and a plate taken out, maybe a knife and a fork. If there's a knife and a fork.
Go gadget?
If there's a plate in there could be a knife and the fork when they get in there. But no, it's really yucky. It's not good. It's going to be a complicated surgery. We were texting back, the three of us, Amy and his wife and I were texting, and she was describing it, and Amy said, "Where is this happening?" And I said, "In his hand."
I don't think that was the question.
It wasn't. It wasn't the question, but it's happening in Wichita.
In Wichita, okay.
His
hand will be in Wichita. Will the rest of it
when
be
it
there?
happens, his whole body will be down there. But
all right.
Long about noon, everybody remember him and his wife in your prayers as they go through this surgery. It's not a simple surgery to do all that and remove all those things from the hardware that's been placed in the past. And so be sure to remember him. Long about noon tomorrow.
If we went and played golf tomorrow afternoon, I might beat him for once.
Yeah. I'll suggest that to him. I'll ask him if he's ready to play golf.
Right.
I won't see him, of course, because you can't see anybody.
Yeah.
If I were to see him, I would say, maybe I'll send him a text and
You may not be able to text either.
say that you challenged him to a round of golf.
It'd be embarrassing when I still lose.
What are we going to talk about tonight?
We are going to finish up the book of Ezekiel tonight.
Where's that going to leave us?
Well, then it will leave us with more books to study, like Daniel.
Oh, that's awesome. Next week is in the Lion's Den?
Yes.
That's
No,
not the
not
Lion's
yet.
Den next week.
We're going to set him up to go in the Lion's Den, though.
Yeah, it's going to be a few weeks before he gets there. We're going to do two chapters a week.
Sure. I don't know. Can we get through 2 chapters a week?
Chapter 1 will be easy. Chapter 2 is going to be a challenge, but we can do it.
Okay.
So we can.
So I suppose you're going to give me chapter 2.
Yeah, you have chapter 2.
Okay.
And so that's how we're going to go.
All
so
right.
You think we're going to start with Ezekiel?
Yes.
So I start first, right?
According to these notes, you must, because that's not my page on top.
I know it. I did some stuff before we got into yours.
Okay.
There's a lot of measuring takes place in these chapters, and there's a reason for that measuring. And although we didn't go verse by verse with it, it's in there for a purpose. Mm-hmm. And if we wanted to know, for example, whether Noah obeyed God in building the ark, how could we tell if he obeyed God?
Well, we could check what he built according to what he was told to build.
We could look at the blueprint and measure the final product and see if it was made out of gopher wood to start with, and if it had rooms and it was covered with pitch, and it was 300 cubits long and 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits tall. We could measure that. Mm-hmm. And what if it's about 200 cubits long?
That would not be accurate.
He didn't do what God told him to do, that's for sure. And if it has a window and it's finished to a cubit from the top and has a door in the side and there's 3 decks, it's not too hard to tell whether he obeyed God or not. You just go out and measure it, and if it fits. And that was true of the tabernacle as they were going through the wilderness, which would make it equally true for the temple later on.
Well, we can't go out and measure it, but we can see in verse 22 that Noah did all according to.
Yes, that is correct. We can let them do the measurements for us.
God must have measured it. If
He must
said
have
he did
measured
it
it.
correct. Yeah.
And so in two places in chapter 25, as they're building the tabernacle, it says, according to all that I'm going to show you, as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all of its furniture, so shall you construct it. And at the very end of that same chapter it says, and see that you make them after the pattern for them, which was shown to you on the mountain. God tells Moses that they had better build it after the pattern. They had better follow the pattern. In chapter 26 and verse 30, he says, then you shall erect the tabernacle according to its plan, which you have been shown in the mountain. And then toward the end of the book, closer to the end of the book, it said, so the sons of Israel did all the work according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. And Moses examined all the work, and behold, they had done it, just as the Lord had commanded. This they had done. So Moses blessed them. Throughout the construction of the tabernacle, and even afterward, it was stressed that it was going to be done according to the plan. It had to be done according to measure. That was significant because Stephen in Acts chapter 7 says, our fathers had the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it according to the pattern which he had seen. And the Hebrew writer says, now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary, and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man, where every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Hence it is necessary that this high priest also have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since these are those who offer the gifts according to the law. There are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, just as Moses was warned by God when he was about to erect the tabernacle. For see, he says, that you make all things according to the pattern which was shown to you on the mountain. Tabernacle was just a reflection of heavenly things. I don't know what all that means, but I know that it's true. And God expected it to be done exactly the way he said, because it was a representation of something spiritual. And God wanted it that way. Which brings us to the measurements beginning in chapter 40.
Yes, sir. So yeah, we've been used to covering 2 chapters, and we're covering 9 tonight. So we're gonna kind of cook through some of these and get make some observations. We will have some readings here and there scattered through where we'll pick up pieces of the text, but for the most part, we're going to kind of synopsis.
Did your mama tell you what time you had to be home tonight?
Well, no.
Because it may be late. If you have,
Do we need to distract Chuck at some point?
if you
Okay.
have to be home by 10, we may have a problem.
I don't have to be home by 10.
Okay.
I can stay out late.
Okay, we're in good shape.
So Ezekiel chapter 40, we are going to look at the first 4 verses there of that section because it gives us some things regarding the date and just kind of the details about what's going to happen. It says, in the 25th year of our exile at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the city was taken, on that same day the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me there. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel, and he set me on a very high mountain, and on it to the south there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. And he said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I am going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see. So, first of all, we're given a specific date. The vision is dated in the 25th year of exile. So, Ezekiel was taken into captivity in 598, so the vision takes place, therefore, 25 years later, which would be 573. I think we can even set that to a more specific time, about April of that year, is where Denny Petrillo had it. So 25 years after he went into exile, but the temple was destroyed in 587. So it's about 14 years after the destruction of the temple. So, all of those historical things play into what Ezekiel is seeing here, because he's seeing a vision of restoration is what this amounts to. And when you think of what the people have lost and what they've been through over the last 25 years, over the last 14 years since the destruction of the temple, a vision of restoration is going to be of particular interest to them. So the fact that he's told to write down and take note of all the details of restoration is a very important thing, because if you had lost everything, your homes, your inheritance, your promised land, the feeling even as if you have lost your God, and then all of a sudden somebody brings a message of restoration, tell me more. I want to know more. I want to know everything. So Ezekiel is instructed to take note. He's placed on, and all of this takes place in a vision. And so with prophetic language and prophetic visions, you have to be careful and make sure that you don't read things into it that are not there, and you don't make too much of some of the things that you see, but then also that you allow them to mean what they're supposed to mean. So Ezekiel is placed atop a high mountain. Well, if he's seeing the restoration of the temple, if he's seeing the restoration of Jerusalem, the temple sits on the highest mountain of that region. There's nothing higher around it. And so we're not supposed to look for a specific mountain that Ezekiel is actually sitting on top of and try to give a geographical location to this mountain. What this signifies that he's being given the perspective of God. God oversees everything. God can see what's happening. And Ezekiel is taken to a place where he's given God's perspective. So he's set up on a very high mountain there. And then he sees a man with implements for measuring. He has a line of flax, which would be a tool that they use for long distance measuring. Flax would be a stable element that would not shrink or stretch or those type of things, but it would hold its shape, it would hold its measurements well. And then he's also given a measuring rod, which would have been the common thing used for house construction. It had a set length. Again, it would have been a stable length. It would have been measured against a standard, and it would have been, everybody would know it and recognize it for what it was. So then the man commences to measure, and this is the part that we're going to kind of jump through from piece to piece. But for the rest, or a good chunk of the chapter 40 there, he starts measuring, and he specifically begins measuring the wall and the outer court of the temple that Ezekiel is being shown. And the walls, these are not military battlements that are super high, that are there for a military purpose, but these are a simple wall that's around the outside of the temple courtyard, the temple complex, that would be a barrier between the common, the profane, and the holy that's inside the courthouse or the compound. So the walls are there to protect the temple from defilement, and showing that they are they're one measuring rod high and one measuring rod thick. They're there and they're serving their purpose, doing exactly what they're supposed to do. At each of the gates that are positioned around that wall that lead into the temple court, there are guard houses, and those guard houses would be a symbol of God's protection, that God is going to be watching over his house. And then there are decorations that are talked about. There are palm trees that are symbols of beauty. Palm trees represent all of these different things: beauty, righteousness, prosperity, fruitfulness, salvation, and victory. So the fact that there are adornments of palm trees all around the temple court and on the walls and on the pillars and all of those places are just an abundant symbol of God's provision in restoring the temple. Verses 28 through 49 then, continuing on in chapter 40, we get inside the walls. So that first part is just measuring the walls and the gates and the guardhouses. Then we get to the inner court and the temple porch. So the actual veranda or whatever that leads into the temple itself. And included in this area, there were areas for priests to perform their duties. There were some rooms that are mentioned that would have been rooms where priests maybe ate of the holy offerings and things, because the priests had to eat some of those things, and they had to have a place to do it that was holy, that was set apart. They couldn't take it out into the courtyard, or they couldn't take it out into public to do that in people's viewing. It had to be done in a holy place. And so there were areas there to perform their duties. There were tables and implements for the slaughter and sacrifice of animals, and it goes into detail about the tables that are built out of stone, and there are hooks to hang the meat on, and there are implements that they use for the slaughtering of all the sacrifices. And then it talks about those who are ministering inside of the temple complex. There are sons of Zadok, and we know from our recent reading through the book of Ezekiel or Exodus and Leviticus that the priestly line descends from Aaron. But then, of course, that line kind of breaks out into branches as Aaron's descendants make their way through. And Zadok was a priest at the time of Solomon, and he was a faithful priest. And so there were many priests that came after Zadok and after Aaron that were unfaithful, that did not do the things they were supposed to do. And those are some of the ones that Ezekiel specifically speaks out against when he's talking about the shepherds of Israel that didn't do their job and those kind of things. And so the specifying here that these are descendants of Zadok signifies that they're going to be righteous. They're going to be faithful, doing the job that God wants them to do and asks them to do, and they're going to be doing that well. So that's the significance there of the idea of the sons of Zadok. So that gets us through chapter 40. Chapter 41, we'll look at the first 4 verses there. It says, "Then he brought me to the nave, and he measured the side pillars. 6 cubits wide on each side was the width of the side pillar, and the width of the entrance was 10 cubits. The sides of the entrance were 5 cubits on each side, and he measured the length of the nave, 40 cubits, and the width, 20 cubits. Then he went inside, and he measured each side pillar of the doorway, 2 cubits, and the doorway 6 cubits high, and the width of the doorway 7 cubits. And he measured its length 20 cubits, and the width 20 cubits before the nave. And he said to me, 'This is the most holy place.'" And so that, just there, a little flavor, if you haven't read through these chapters of Ezekiel in a while or ever, that's kind of the way a lot of this progresses, that there's very specific measurements given of each of the components of the temple or the courtyard or the wall or whatever that the man is measuring. And this one it's called the nave, but he says this is the holy place. So we know from our reading recently again of Exodus and Leviticus that the tabernacle, when it was constructed, it had the first inner room was the holy place, and then there was a curtain that hung up that separated it from the most holy place where the ark was. And so as he enters into the nave, and Ezekiel, remember, is a priest. He is a priest, so it's okay for Ezekiel, even in a vision, to go into the nave, into the holy place, because that's an appropriate place for him to be. But then as his guide, the measuring guy, he is the only one that goes into the most holy place, and he reports back to Ezekiel the measurements of that most holy place. So Ezekiel does not enter in, even in his vision, into the most holy place, which I thought was interesting, that even in his vision he was not allowed to enter into the most holy place. So those are the things that are being measured at this point, or as those components of the temple. So the chapter continues with verses 5 through 26. There are lots of details given about side chambers and furnishings, because there were things inside the temple. There was the altar of showbread, there was the altar of incense, there was a table of showbread. There were other implements that were in there, and it's specified that there are 90 side chambers whose functions are not specified. And these would have been, again, places where the priests were able to perhaps change their clothes, because priests couldn't wear their street clothes into the temple, nor could they wear their temple clothes out into the street. They had to have a place to change clothes. They had to have places where they could eat their meals. They had to have places where they could store their implements when they weren't using certain things. So there was just a lot of rooms that were available for priests to use that nobody else would have ever seen. And yet all of those are measured, and they're all laid out as being part of what is appropriate. Again, they are decorated with cherubs, and the cherubs are interesting. They have on the face of one, they have two faces. On one side a man, on one side a lion, and the lion faces one way, and then the man faces the other, and in between them there's a palm tree. So just more symbols of God's protection, of His sovereignty, of His approval of the things that are being measured here. So then we get to chapter 42. Verses 1 through 14, again, another section that are called the priest's chamber buildings. And this specifically would have been places where the priests changed clothing, where they had eating and storage, and these rooms were holy and only to be used by priests. They did not have access by or for anyone else. Only of the priestly servants could go in there and use those places. And then verses 15 through 20, says, "Now when he had finished measuring the inner house, he brought me out by way of the gate, which faced toward the east, and he measured it all around. He measured on the east side with the measuring reed 500 reeds by the measuring reed. He measured on the north side 500 reeds by the measuring reed. On the south side, 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He turned to the west side and he measured 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He measured it on the four sides, had a wall all around, the length 500 and the width 500 to divide between the holy and the profane. Now, for you and me, 500 measuring reeds, that sounds like a lot, but I don't really know. But the New American Standard there has the approved, like the actual translation. If you translate it faithfully, I think some other modern translations give other renderings of what that measurement might be. But 500 reeds is literally what it says. And if that's true, then it was more than 7 miles. 500 reeds is a distance of more than 7 miles. So the man goes out and he measures one reed at a time to a distance of 7 miles. And he comes back and he measures the other direction, 500 reeds, 7 miles. So we're talking about something of an area that, when it's all said and done, is greater than 60 square miles. And this is the temple. And this is just one of the indications to us that we're not supposed to take this literally. There's no indication that God ever intended for his temple complex to be that big. And so Solomon's temple was nowhere nearly approaching that. The temple that was built by Herod in the time of Jesus, that he would have been there, was bigger than Solomon's, but it was nowhere near this. And so as we're looking at these things, we're looking for the symbolic meaning. We're looking for what does God intend us to understand from the size of this complex, not that we're looking for somebody at a future time to actually build this thing. What does 500 reeds signify to us?
500 reeds.
It's really big.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a place of such immense size, and when it's measured and it comes out to that level of accuracy and that level of detail, there's only one explanation for how it got to be that way. There's not a human architect behind this. There's not a human intelligence behind this. This is the work of God. God is the one who is performing this restoration and nobody else. And so that's the purpose here. So it represents the greatness of God and his ability to provide for the needs of his people. We've talked, over the last few weeks, as we talked about the army that, Gog and Magog, and that battle, and it signified God's protection, that only God could protect them. Well, here's another symbol that shows us that only God can provide this level of greatness for his people. Then we get to chapter 43, and chapter 43 could be the most important part of this section, but it's certainly a part to take notice of. So we're going to read the first 5 verses here. It says, "Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east." This is the gate that he just led Ezekiel out of, and he leads him back to that gate. The gate facing toward the east. "Behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east, and his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the visions which I saw by the river Kibar, and I fell on my face. The glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house." I don't know that we can put into perspective what Ezekiel must have seen here, or what he must have felt at seeing this. Even though it's in a vision, it's not physically taking place, it is in a vision. But remember what Ezekiel has witnessed through the book. And if we went back, if you can remember all the way back to when we were early in the study in chapters 8 through 11, Ezekiel saw some horrible visions, some visions of destruction and visions of God's glory leaving the temple. And the things that he saw, the profanities and the bad stuff that was going on inside the temple complex, because the leaders of the people were sacrificing to false gods, and they were committing acts of harlotry and prostitution, and there was murder, and there was all of this absolute filth that was taking place inside the temple complex. And God sent out his rider that went out through the city and was slaying people and was destroying the city. And then eventually God's presence leaves the temple, and it goes out this eastern gate and disappears to the east. And that's the vision, that's the last vision that Ezekiel had of the temple. before he comes now to chapter 40 and he begins this vision of the restoration of the temple. So if you look at the vision that Ezekiel has there in chapter 11, it concludes with God departing from Jerusalem. There in 11:22 through 23, it says, "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings, the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain which is east of the city." And so God's presence left the temple, and it went to the east, which in some ways provides a comfort for the people, because that's the direction they went into captivity. So it's almost as if God is saying, I'm not abandoning you to captivity. I'm going into captivity with you. I'm not staying behind in my house. I'm going with you to captivity. Now Ezekiel is seeing this grand vision of a temple restored, but what good is a temple if God doesn't live there anymore? What good is a temple restored if it's not God's dwelling place? And so as awesome as this vision is that Ezekiel has seen, with the splendor and the size and the magnitude and the decorations of all the stuff that the guy has laid out for him, God's still not there. But now Ezekiel looks to the east, and what does he see? He sees the glory of God returning. And the glory of God returns, and it goes through that eastern gate and fills the temple once again. So this is all just a reminder of what we've been through up to this point. It's a recap of the entire book. God's departure from Jerusalem was a result of the continued sins of the people. That's what led to the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It was their sin. That's what brought about God's departure from the temple in the first place. The return of God to the temple would provide hope to the captives, that this was not a permanent abandonment, that God had not just left them in captivity to rot, but that they would once again have God in their presence and in his temple as it was supposed to be. It was also an indication that God had not abandoned them, nor had he forgotten his covenant. We've talked about a lot in the last few weeks about God being a God of covenant, and God is remembering his covenant, and he is going to finish out what he started. Even though we took this detour along the way of captivity, God's not done yet. So then verses 6 through 12, God speaks from the temple, and he says, "This is the place of my throne." Again, what music that must have been to Ezekiel's ears, to hear God say that, declaring that this is the place of my throne. And the interesting thing about that is God had never declared the temple in Jerusalem the place of his throne before. There are passages which declare the temple in Jerusalem as his footstool, but God's throne has always been in heaven, and the temple has been his footstool. But now this reborn temple, this restored temple that Ezekiel is seeing, God is saying, this will be my throne. And that is an indication of the level of God's commitment to his seeing through the covenant and seeing through the promises that he has made. However, God's return is conditional upon the people obeying his voice. This is not just a blanket statement saying, I'm going to come back and you can do whatever you want. This is, I'm going to come back and you are going to do what I've asked you to do. You're going to be the people I've asked you to be. You're going to be my people the way I want you to be my people, the way you should have been the whole time before. So Ezekiel must tell the people of his vision so that they will be ashamed of their iniquities. They had this relationship with God before. They had God living in their midst, dwelling in their midst. They chased him off because of their sins. This is not God's fault that they are where they are. But God is willing to reconcile with them, but they need to understand they can't live the lives that they used to live. Verses 13 through 27, Ezekiel continues to see visions of now he's getting into some more specific parts of the temple, which really pair well with some of the reading that we've been doing in the early books of the Bible right now, with the altar of burnt offerings and some of the things, we've read in Exodus, Leviticus, now this week in Numbers. But the altar of burnt offerings, it's interesting here that the altar stands between the entrance gate of the courtyard and the entrance of the temple. So if you walked in the main gate into the courtyard in the front of the temple, you had to either walk around the altar or past the altar to get to the entrance into the temple. And that signified that there's something that has to take place before the priest can go into the temple. They have to be cleansed. They have to make atonement for their sin. They have to be forgiven of their sin before they can approach God. So that altar stands between the gate into the courtyard and their access to the temple. And once again, here we have the reminder that only descendants of Zadok could use the altar. And there's a cleansing ceremony that takes 8 days. We've seen that before in the ordination of the priests in Leviticus chapters 8 through 10, where there was a 7-day ceremony. On the 8th day, they gave those final sacrifices that signified that ceremony was complete and the priests were sanctified. The same type of ceremony has to take place for the altar that's being presented here in Ezekiel. There's an 8-day cleansing ceremony that takes place for that before they can begin actually offering altars or sacrifices on that altar for their own sins. Then we get to chapter 44, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Then he brought me back by the way of the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces the east, and it was shut. And the Lord said to me, This gate shall be shut, shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it. Therefore it shall be shut. As for the prince, he shall sit in it as prince to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the porch of the gate and go out by the same way." So there's an eastern gate that God has come through, and it's now to be shut. That's not to be used for common purposes. No regular person gets to go in and out of this gate. An exception is made for the prince of the land, and it's interesting that he's never called a king. And I think that's probably because there never will be another physical king over Israel the way that there have been kings in the past. But there's a prince who gets to use that gate. And there are qualifications then given to those who can, when you enter by the south gate into the tabernacle, into the temple courtyard, you have to leave by the north gate. And if you enter by the north gate, you have to leave by the south gate. You don't get to turn around and go back out the way you came. But the one exception to that is the prince, who gets to enter and leave by the same gate that he used. In verses 4 through 31, then we have the qualifications for the priests who serve in the temple. And a lot of this reads a lot like the same things that we've read through Leviticus and Exodus in the earlier readings of this year. Some of the very, very similar wording, very similar outlines and regulations are given. It would sound very familiar if you've been keeping up with the daily reading. Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord fill the temple, and we're reminded of other times when we've seen that kind of the thing happen when at the dedication of the tabernacle, when the glory of the Lord filled it. At the dedication of Solomon's temple, the glory of the Lord filled it. So this is, again, God's stamp of approval upon this temple that's being rededicated. The Levites at this point are designated to menial tasks. In the readings that we've had recently in the early books, the Levites had major tasks. They were given big duties to do. But under this system, because of their unfaithfulness leading up to this, now they've been demoted. They still are needed. You got to have people that clean out the ashes. You got to have people that do the menial labor that needs to be done. But they will not attain to the level of authority that they had before. Descendants of Zadok, once again, are mentioned as those who would serve as priests, and the priestly garments are described, and they're similar again to the ones that we've read about in earlier readings. And then many of the regulations regarding priests that we read in Leviticus are repeated. And then there's an inheritance of the priests that's described that has to do with their allotment of land and cities, as well as providing for them from the sacrifices that are offered in the temple.
And I think it's significant that the measurements take place before God enters the temple. If he's going to come back, it has to be ready.
Right.
And if we understand the Hebrew writer correctly, that, as you say, this is not the physical temple. This is the ideal temple. This is a shadow of what's in heaven. And so it is perfect in every way. All the measurements, although we may not understand, they're perfect. And as you say, these are not literal measurements. They're never intended to be literal because they don't make sense if they're literal. I think it's significant that they took the measurements and everything measured, and then now God can come back in.
Right.
He can come back in there. The last chapter is from 55, and first part of 45, first 6 verses, they begin to divide the land. And he says, when you shall divide by lot the land for inheritance, you shall offer an allotment to the Lord, a holy portion of the land. The length shall be the length of 25,000 cubits, and the width shall be 10,000. It shall be holy within all its boundary round about. And by the way, in the translations that we both use, if a word is supplied in the original but it's not there, it's in italics. I usually take those italics out because it just makes it confusing to read. But I left them in here because that word cubits is not in the text. It just says 25,000, 10,000. New American Standard says 10,000. It's because it's based on the Masoretic text. Some others say 20,000 because they're based on the Septuagint. But one possibility is that it doesn't say cubits and it doesn't say rods or reeds, because that's not important. It's not the measurement that matters. And here, if we're talking 25,000 reeds, it'd be the land that we're going to see a lot of go out into the Mediterranean and across the Jordan, and so it can't literally be reeds. If it's cubits, it'd be too narrow. And it's just another bit of evidence that we're talking about symbolic things, not about literal things. But anyway, every place where it doesn't really say cubits, but the New American Standard says cubits, I've left it in italics. Out of this there shall be for the holy place a square round about 500 by 500 cubits, and 50 cubits for its open space round about. And that word cubits is in there, and I don't have any idea why that's the only place that it has that. And from this area you shall measure a length of 25,000 cubits and a width of 10,000 cubits, and in it shall be the sanctuary, the most holy place. It shall be the holy portion of the land. It shall be for the priests, the ministers of the sanctuary, who come near to minister to the Lord, and it shall be a place for their houses and a holy place for the sanctuary. And an area 25,000 cubits in length and 10,000 in width shall be for the Levites, the ministers of the house, and for their possession cities to dwell in. And you shall give the city possession of an area 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, alongside the allotment of the holy portion. It shall be for the whole house of Israel. And the portion you were talking about, you have the measurements of the temple. And now we're starting to expand to measure outside the temple, the city and the country and so forth. And so now we're measuring outside. It's significant, though, that it specifies that the first allotment is for God. Before he starts allotting anything else, the first allotment is God's. You remember in Malachi where the people are questioning God about everything. And it says, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house. And test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. God says, you give me the first allotment, and then everything else is going to be okay. You remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul says, now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability, and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much entreaty for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. First they gave themselves to God as his allotment, and then everything else followed. It's significant, I think, in these measurements as it goes out that the first allotment goes to God. There's another interesting little section there in verses 10 through 12. It says, you shall have just balances, a just ephah and a just bath. The ephah and the bath shall be the same quantity, so that the bath may contain 1/10 of a homer, and the ephah 1/10 of a homer. Their standard shall be according to the homer, and the shekel shall be 20 gerahs, 20 shekels, 25 shekels, and 15 shekels shall be your manna. And the whole point of this is that God cares about honesty. He expects, here he's speaking to the princes, but it's true about all of us. God expects us to be honest. I've shown pictures, I think, of in medieval city halls on the side of the wall that have pieces of metal embedded, and this is a yard. And if someone buys a yard from a merchant, they can come check on that rod and make sure the merchant didn't cheat them. And we've talked about merchants that had two sets of weights, a set for buying and a set for selling. And when they would buy, they would get more than whatever the weight was. When they would sell, they would give less, and they'd make a profit both ways. And God is not impressed with that kind of dealing. We run into the east gate again in the first part of chapter 46. Thus says the Lord God, the gate of the inner court facing east shall be shut the 6 working days, but it shall be opened on the Sabbath day and opened on the day of the new moon. And the prince shall enter by way of the porch of the gate from outside and stand by the post of the gate. Then the priest shall provide his burnt offering and his peace offerings, and he shall worship at the threshold of the gate and then go out. But the gate shall not be shut until the evening. The people of the land shall also worship at the doorway of that gate before the Lord on the Sabbaths and on the new moons. And the burnt offering which the prince shall offer to the Lord on the Sabbath day shall be 6 lambs without blemish, and a ram without blemish. And the grain offering shall be an ephah with the ram, and the grain offering with the rams, as much as he is able to give, and a hin of oil with an ephah. And so that east gate that was shut is open on the Sabbath. Still, only the prince can really approach that gate. The people are not allowed to go in and out through that gate. But it is open on the Sabbath and then on the new moon. And so it's interesting that and when the prince is making a free will offering is another exception to that. There's a real significant passage, I think, in chapter 47. That's the first 10 verses of chapter 47. He says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. And the water was flowing down from under, from the right side of the house, from south of the altar. And he brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the inner gate, by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. When the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he led me through the water, water reaching the ankles. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, water reaching the knees. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, water reaching the loins. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not ford, for the water had risen, enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were very many trees, on the one side and on the other. Then he said to me, These waters go out toward the eastern region, and go down into the Arabah. Then they go down toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. And it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there will be very many fish, for these waters go there, and the others become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it, from En-Gedi to Englaim, where there will be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, like the fish of the great sea, very many." This water, this river, is very symbolic in prophecy for God's blessings. When he blesses his people, once again, this is the image of that blessing, the river. In the 46th Psalm, it says, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High." Joel, in chapter 2, makes that prophecy that Peter quotes on the day of Pentecost. And he goes on in chapter 3 and says, "It will come about in that day that the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valley of Shittim. In that day a fountain will be opened," he says in the next chapter, or the same one. "In that day a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and for impurity." In the next chapter, in verse 8, he says, "And it will come about in that day that living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea, and it will be in summer as well as in winter." And the picture that Zechariah paints here is of God's blessings flowing out everywhere. And I don't think it's a stretch to associate that with what Joel said in Zechariah's prophecy too. He's talking about the Messiah. And so both of these, I think, apply to the fact that from the day of Pentecost, these waters flowed out of Jerusalem. And we have the privilege today to participate in the spread of that water. And the farther out it gets, the deeper it gets, and it turns everything fresh. And as we talk about rivers like that, we're reminded of how everything started with the Garden of Eden. There was a river that flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and it became 4 rivers. And it's the same picture we see at the end of the Bible in Revelation chapter 22 in the first 5 verses. "And he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb in the middle of its street. And on either side of the river there was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it. And his bondservants shall serve him, and they shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. And there shall no longer be any night, and they shall not have need of the lamp of a light of a lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God shall illumine them, and they shall reign forever and ever." picture of that water flowing out from the temple is just God's future blessing on his people. And that's what it's like when God comes back. When God returns, that's the result. It goes a little bit later in that same passage, though, and it says that its swamps and marshes will not become fresh, for they will be left for salt. I'm not sure quite how to take that, whether in Revelation the outside is reserved for the nations and so forth. This isn't talking just about the day of judgment. It's talking about now. But there are outlying areas that where the water hasn't reached yet. I don't know if that's what it is. I don't remember if it was Petrello or McGuigan that suggested that they needed salt for their sacrifices. And so maybe that was a possibility for the salt to remain. Is he really going to ring that bell? He creates boundaries for the land. He divides the land for an inheritance among the 12 tribes in Ezekiel 47, 13, and 14, and then again in verse 22. And the important thing is that God draws a boundary around his people. We've mentioned many times the definition of predestination does not mean that God chose ahead of time who's going to be saved and not be saved. It has to do with the word for horizon, and it just means God draws a circle around his people. And so what God is doing here with these boundaries, he's just making a boundary around his people. And that's what's happening in these chapters. Petrello and McGuigan both had a chart like this, so I thought I had to make one.
Okay.
And if you look at the description of the land that was allotted to these people, and this isn't according to scale, but it's a strip that goes from west to east. And it starts with Dan and then goes all the way down through Judah. And then in the midst of that, there's an area for the temple with the priests on either side, the Levites, and for the Jerusalem, and then for the city. And then outside of that, there's some land for the prince. And then below it finishes the 12 tribes. And I don't know if there's any significance in this other than the fact that it's very ordered, very organized. It's God has planned it because of its order. And that's the picture that's drawn in those remaining chapters. The last verse is very significant. There's no better way to wrap up the book of Ezekiel and to wrap up our study of Ezekiel than with the very last chapter, or last verse of the last chapter. He says, "The city shall be 18,000 cubits round about, and the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there."
Amen.
And then they will know that he is Lord, because that's where he lives. And that's just a good way to wrap up the book, saying that the name of the city is the Lord is there.
I'd like to go to that city.
I think we are. I think you can. I think you're part of that city.
Good.
Yeah. You're already there. And it just gets better. Because the other side of that city is even better than this side of the city.
Yeah.
It's a city that spans the grave. And we'll see that when we get to Revelation. If you try to limit it to the church, it doesn't make sense. If you try to limit it to heaven, it doesn't make sense. And so the answer is yes.
There you go.
We do have some questions.
Yes.
Okay.
Always.
What are they?
Why is Ezekiel shown the measurements of the temple in such detail? I couldn't hear you.
Gary said earlier that they had to know it was perfectly ready for God to enter back.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
They had to be ready for him to come back.
Yeah.
So why is he showing all those other measurements in such detail?
Because it has to do with God's provision for his people. God doesn't do anything. God doesn't forget anything when he's providing for his people. It's not. Yeah.
It's all laid out according to plan, down to the smallest detail. What is the most significant event that Ezekiel sees happen in his vision?
I know.
I can guess what you would say, and I think I'd probably agree with you. I think there are two significant events, but I know which one you're going to say. Do they know what it is?
I don't know. They won't say it.
Are they afraid?
I told you what it was. The Lord is, when the Lord shows up.
Yeah.
I think it's when the Lord returns, when Ezekiel sees him come from the east
Comes back in.
and enter through that eastern gate.
And another significant event I thought was when that water flows out from underneath the temple and goes out and just gets deeper and deeper. And the bottom line is the last words is God lives here. This is where God lives. And the last question for them is,
Why are priestly duties limited to the descendants of Zadok? He was faithful.
he was the one that was faithful. And so he's used as a symbol. His faithfulness is a symbol of faithfulness.
We did it.
We did it. We covered a jillion chapters all at once. Next week we will begin, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise.
Daniel.
Can we sing all those songs?
Did you see the first two chapters?
The first 2 chapters of Daniel next week is what Gary told me we have to cover.
Yeah, we'll see how that
He's a
works.
slave driver.
He's cracking his whip.
Yeah.
I don't know. As I say, the first chapter won't be too hard to cover, but it's that second chapter that gets it a little bit.
I like the part where Daniel won't eat the king's dainties.
Yeah, he won't eat the dainties.
The dainties.
The dainties. The king's dainties. He won't touch them. Thank you very much. Don't forget to take your tape measures home with you.